The November rain fell in sheets across Camp Meridian, turning the Virginia clay into rivers of rust-colored mud that swallowed boots and splattered against the wooden barracks like accusations. Inside Kitchen Block C, Sergeant Mae Holloway stood before an industrial oven that radiated heat like a small sun, basting a 20-pound turkey with butter she had traded 3 cigarette rations to acquire. The bird glistened amber under the fluorescent lights, its skin crackling with promise, and for a moment, just a moment, Mae forgot she was cooking for the enemy. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The camp had arrived in her life like an unwanted inheritance. 6 months ago, the War Department had converted the old textile mill complex into a detention facility for female prisoners of war, and Mae, with her culinary school certificate and her brother's death certificate both dated 1944, had been assigned to feed them. She'd accepted the position with the grim determination of someone who understood that survival sometimes meant swallowing your rage with your morning coffee. Through the steam-fogged window, she could see them gathering in the mess hall. 73 German women, most between 18 and 40, wearing the regulation gray dresses that made them look like ghosts of themselves. They moved with the careful efficiency of people who'd learned that drawing attention meant inviting trouble. Mae had memorized their faces over the months, though she'd never learned most of their names. There was the tall blonde with the scar bisecting her left eyebrow who always sat in the corner. The redhead with pianist's hands who helped wash dishes without being asked. The older woman with silver threading through her dark hair who whispered prayers before every meal in a language Mae refused to understand. "You're really doing this, then?" came a voice behind her. Mae didn't turn. She recognized the disapproval in Captain Patricia Vance's tone, had heard it in various forms since she'd announced her Thanksgiving plan 3 weeks ago. "I'm following orders, ma'am," Mae said, though they both knew the orders had been vague: provide appropriate nutrition, and left interpretation to the discretion of camp personnel. "There's appropriate, and then there's turkey with all the fixings." Patricia moved into Mae's peripheral vision, her uniform pressed sharp enough to cut. She was younger than Mae by 2 years, but carried her authority like a shield. "Half the town thinks we're too soft on them as it is. You know what they're saying at Mulligan's bar? That we should be feeding them gruel and water." Mae pulled the turkey from the oven, set it on the prep counter with a heavy thud. The aroma filled the kitchen: sage and thyme, butter and black pepper. The smell of her grandmother's house on holidays before the war turned feast days into hollow performances. "And what do you think, Patricia?" The captain was quiet for a long moment, watching as Mae began carving, the knife moving with practiced precision through breast meat that fell away in perfect slices. "I think," she finally said, "that my fiancé died in the Ardennes. I think that when I close my eyes, I see the telegram my mother received, and I think about all the boys who won't taste turkey this year or any year after." "I think about that every single day," Mae said quietly. She set down the knife, turned to face Patricia fully. "Tommy was 22. He wrote me letters about a French girl he had met, about how after the war he was going to open a restaurant in Richmond, and about how killing people made him feel like he was drowning from the inside out." She gestured toward the window, toward the women in the mess hall. "You think I don't look at them and see the hands that might have loaded the guns? But I also see what we become when we let hate do all our cooking." Patricia's expression softened just slightly around the edges. "The town council is meeting next week. Reverend Michaels has been asking questions about camp operations, about costs, about where our priorities lie." "Let them ask," Mae said. She picked up the carving knife again. "In the meantime, I've got stuffing that needs attention and sweet potatoes that won't candy themselves." The captain left without another word, and Mae returned to her work. She had prepared enough food for a small army: 3 turkeys, 2 hams, mountains of mashed potatoes, green bean casserole made with actual cream instead of the powdered substitute, cranberry sauce from berries she'd picked herself in the woods beyond the camp fence, and pies. God, so many pies. Pumpkin and apple and pecan, their crusts golden brown and flaking, their fillings rich with spices that made the kitchen smell like a memory of better days. At 1700 hours, the women filed in for the evening meal, and Mae watched their faces change when they saw the spread. Confusion first, then suspicion, then something that looked almost like pain. They formed their usual orderly line, moving toward the serving station with the mechanical precision of people accustomed to institutional life. But their steps were slower now, hesitant. Mae stood behind the counter, ladle in hand, and met each pair of eyes that dared to look up at her. Most didn't. They held out their trays in silence, and she filled them with portions that would have been generous even for paying customers. Turkey and ham, sweet potatoes glazed with brown sugar and butter, stuffing fragrant with herbs, green beans in their cream sauce, a roll still warm from the oven, cranberry sauce that caught the light like rubies. The tall blonde with the scar was third in line. She stared at her loaded tray as if it were a riddle she couldn't solve, then looked up at Mae with eyes the color of winter sky. "Warum?" she asked, so softly it was almost lost in the clatter of the mess hall. Mae didn't speak German, but she understood the question. Why? She'd been asking herself the same thing for 3 weeks, ever since she'd submitted her Thanksgiving menu proposal to the camp director and watched his eyebrows rise toward his hairline. "Because it's Thursday," Mae said, which wasn't really an answer at all, but it was the best she had. The woman moved on, and the line continued. Mae served them all, every one of the 73, and then she took off her apron and walked to the small table in the corner where she always ate alone, where she could watch without being watched too closely. For the first 5 minutes, the silence in the mess hall was so complete Mae could hear the November wind rattling the windows. The women sat with their loaded trays before them, forks held uncertainly, as if the food might transform into something else if they looked away. Mae cut into her own turkey, brought it to her mouth, chewed and swallowed, a permission given without words. And then, slowly, they began to eat. Mae had learned to cook from her grandmother, a woman who believed that food was the only honest language, that you could say things with a properly roasted chicken that would get lost in regular conversation. Every Sunday, Mae had stood on a wooden stool beside the big cast-iron stove in her grandmother's Baltimore kitchen, learning to brown onions until they turned sweet, to knead bread until the dough fought back, to taste and adjust and trust her instincts more than any recipe. Tommy had loved those Sunday dinners. He'd sit at the table with his elbows planted, despite their mother's protests, watching Mae work with the kind of attention other boys reserved for baseball scores. "You're going to be famous someday," he'd tell her, grinning around a mouthful of pot roast. "You're going to have your own restaurant, and I'm going to tell everyone my sister's the best cook in America." But then Pearl Harbor happened, and Tommy enlisted before their mother could stop him, and Mae's culinary school dreams got folded up and put away like wedding dresses after a funeral. She'd taken a job at the munitions plant instead, packing shells with the careful precision she'd once reserved for layering Napoleons, and she'd tried not to think about what those shells would do when they reached their destinations. The telegram came on a Tuesday. Mae had been at work, her hands stained with cordite, when her supervisor called her into the office. She'd known before she saw the Western Union envelope, known from the way Mrs. Patterson's eyes couldn't quite meet hers, from the way the other women on the line had gone quiet as she'd walked past. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your brother, Private Thomas Holloway, was killed in action." She'd read those words so many times they'd stopped meaning anything. They were just shapes, Letters arranged in an order designed to transform your entire life into before and after, into the world where Tommy existed and the world where he didn't. Mae hadn't cried, not when she read the telegram, not at the funeral with its flag-draped empty casket, not during the long month that followed when her mother stopped cooking entirely and their house filled with silence so thick you could choke on it. She'd stored her grief somewhere deep, in a place she didn't have to look at it, and she'd kept moving forward because stopping meant drowning. When the War Department offered her the position at Camp Meridian, her mother had begged her not to take it. "How can you feed them?" she'd asked, her voice brittle as old paper. "How can you stand in a room with the people who killed your brother and pretend you're doing anything but serving the devil?" Mae hadn't known how to explain that she wasn't pretending anything, that feeding the German women felt like the only honest work she'd done since Tommy died, that every meal she prepared was a choice to see them as human despite everything, to refuse to let hate do her thinking for her. The camp itself existed in a strange liminal space. It wasn't quite a prison, though the women couldn't leave. It wasn't quite a refugee center, though most of them had nowhere to return to. The war had ended in May, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and repatriation was complicated when the country you'd fought for no longer existed in quite the same shape. Most of the women had been Wehrmacht auxiliaries, radio operators, secretaries, nurses in field hospitals. A few had been true believers, party members who'd worn their politics like armor. Others had simply been German, caught in the machinery of a war they hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. The American government was still sorting through which category each woman fell into, still deciding who could eventually go home and who would face trial for war crimes. Mae had no illusions about innocence. She knew some of these women had done terrible things, had been complicit in terrible things, had stood by while terrible things happened. But she also knew that sorting people into neat categories of good and evil was harder than it looked from a distance, that proximity complicated certainty. She learned their routines over the months. They woke at 0600, made their beds with military precision, and ate breakfast in silence. Some worked in the camp laundry, others in the small vegetable garden that provided supplemental rations. They attended mandatory English classes in the afternoon, taught by a local school teacher named Mrs. Henderson, who treated them with the kind of patient firmness usually reserved for difficult children. In the evenings, they were allowed 2 hours of recreation, reading, letter writing, or quiet conversation in the common room. The tall blonde with the scar was named Greta Schneider, Mae had learned from the camp roster. She'd been a field nurse, stationed near Aachen when American forces overran her position. The redhead with pianist's hands was Ilse Baumann, a radio operator who spoke 4 languages. The older woman who prayed before meals was Helga Zimmermann, a widow whose husband had died in the first year of the war, and whose son had been conscripted at 16 and never returned. Mae had told herself she didn't want to know their stories, that knowing would make everything harder, but information leaked through anyway, in overheard conversations, in reports that crossed her desk, in the way certain women flinched at sudden noises or went silent when the camp director walked past. On the morning after Thanksgiving, Mae arrived at the kitchen at 0500, as always, to find 3 women already waiting by the door. Greta, Ilse, and a younger woman named Annalise, who usually kept to herself. They stood in the pre-dawn darkness, breath misting in the November cold, and when Mae approached with her ring of keys, they didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her with an intensity that made her hands shake as she unlocked the door. "We help," Greta said in careful English. It wasn't a question. She should have said no. Should have reminded them that kitchen work wasn't part of their camp assignment, that fraternization beyond basic necessity violated a dozen unwritten rules. But she looked at their faces, at the desperate need to do something, to offer something, to respond to the previous night's meal in the only language they had, and found herself nodding instead. "Dishes first," she said, gesturing toward the industrial sinks. "Then we'll start breakfast prep." They worked in silence, the 3 German women and the American cook, whose brother they might have killed. and for 2 hours the only sounds were running water, the clink of dishes, the rhythmic chop of knives on cutting boards. Mae showed them how she liked the potatoes cut, how to crack eggs without getting shell in the bowl, how to gauge when the oatmeal was the right consistency. They learned quickly. These women who'd survived a war and its aftermath, who'd learned that adaptation was the price of survival. The trouble started on Monday morning, when Reverend Michaels arrived at the camp director's office with 12 members of his congregation and a petition signed by 300 townspeople. Mae heard about it from Patricia, who'd been present for the meeting and emerged looking like she'd aged 5 years in an hour. "They want you fired," Patricia said bluntly, finding Mae in the kitchen during the afternoon lull. "They want an investigation into excessive expenditure and inappropriate fraternization with enemy personnel." Those are direct quotes. Mae's hands stilled on the bread dough she'd been kneading. For one Thanksgiving dinner? For one Thanksgiving dinner that cost the camp $47 in premium ingredients, when the standard daily food budget is $12 total. For allowing German prisoners to work in the kitchen without supervision. Patricia pulled out a folded paper from her pocket, read from it, demonstrating a troubling lack of patriotic sentiment and insulting the memory of our fallen heroes. The words hit like physical blows, but Mae kept her expression neutral, kept kneading the dough with steady pressure. "I see. Director Morrison is convening a formal review board. You'll need to testify, explain your decisions." Patricia's voice softened slightly. "Mae, I warned you. I told you how this would look." "You did." Mae shaped the dough into a smooth ball, placed it in a greased bowl, covered it with a damp cloth. "What do you think I should have done differently?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "That's the hell of it. I don't know what the right answer is anymore." The review board convened 3 days later in the camp director's conference room. Mae sat across from a panel of 5 people. Director Morrison, a weary man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Reverend Michaels, whose righteous anger radiated off him like heat. Mrs. Eleanor Brickman, head of the local Veterans Auxiliary. Major Sullivan from the Army's Inspector General office. And surprisingly, Mrs. Henderson, the English teacher. Reverend Michaels led the questioning, his voice carrying the theatrical resonance of someone accustomed to speaking from pulpits. "Sergeant Holloway, would you explain to this board why you felt it appropriate to serve a festive meal to enemy prisoners while American families struggle with continued rationing?" Mae had prepared for this question. "Sir, the meal cost approximately $15 more than our standard daily budget. The additional expense was covered by my personal funds, not taxpayer money. I used my cigarette rations to trade for butter and sugar. No government resources were diverted." "That's not the point," Mrs. Brickman interjected. Her son had lost both legs at Normandy. Mae had seen him around town navigating the sidewalks in his wheelchair with grim determination. "My son will never walk again. He'll never dance at his own wedding, never chase his children through the yard. And you're serving his enemies turkey and pie?" "I'm serving human beings, a meal. That's my job, Mrs. Brickman, to provide nutrition to the people in this camp's custody." "There's nutrition and then there's celebration," Reverend Michaels said. "Thanksgiving is a sacred American tradition. By extending it to enemy prisoners, you've degraded its meaning." Major Sullivan leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant, in your time running the camp kitchen, have there been any disciplinary issues, any food-related illnesses, any complaints from the prisoners about meal quality or quantity?" "No, sir, none." And the German women who've been working in the kitchen, were they compensated for this labor? No, sir. They volunteered. Under what circumstances? Mae chose her words carefully. They approached me the morning after Thanksgiving and offered to help. I interpreted this as a desire to contribute to camp operations and accepted their assistance with daily kitchen tasks, primarily dishwashing and basic food preparation. Without seeking approval from camp administration, Director Morrison noted, though his tone was more resigned than accusatory. I operated under the assumption that utilizing prisoner labor for camp maintenance fell within my operational discretion, sir. Mrs. Henderson spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd spent 30 years teaching high school English. If I may, I'd like to offer a perspective from my interactions with the prisoners. She didn't wait for permission. These women attend my English classes 5 afternoons a week. I've watched them struggle with vocabulary, with grammar, with the basic mechanics of communication. But the Monday after Thanksgiving, something had changed. They participated more actively, asked more questions. Several of them wrote essays, unprompted, about gratitude and hope. Reverend Michael scoffed. Essays about gratitude from the people who brought the world gas chambers and death camps? Forgive me if I find that less than compelling. I'm not asking you to forgive anything, Mrs. Henderson said sharply. I'm simply reporting what I observed. These women are human beings, Reverend, whatever else they may be. And human beings respond to kindness even when, especially when, they don't expect it or deserve it. The questioning continued for another hour, circling through the same territory with variations: the cost, the appropriateness, the symbolism. Mae answered each query with the same steady patience, refusing to be provoked into anger or defensive justification. Finally, Director Morrison called for a brief recess. The panel filed out, leaving Mae alone in the conference room. She stared at the wall-mounted map of Europe, at the colored pins marking occupation zones, at the way Germany had been divided into sections like a pie at a church social. Patricia slipped into the room, closed the door behind her. That could have gone worse. Could it have? Mae's voice was flat. Mrs. Henderson's testimony helped, and Major Sullivan seems more interested in operational efficiency than moral philosophy. Patricia sat down across from Mae. But Mae, you need to understand, this isn't just about one dinner. This town is full of people who lost sons and brothers and husbands. They're angry, and they're looking for somewhere to put that anger. You've made yourself a target. I know. Do you? Because I'm not sure you understand what that means. There are people in this town who see you as a traitor, who think you've chosen the enemy over your own people, over your own brother. Mae looked at her friend, saw the genuine concern there, the fear. What would you have me do? I don't know, Patricia admitted, but I know this can't continue. The kitchen volunteers, the extra attention, it has to stop. The panel returned before Mae could respond. Director Morrison cleared his throat, looked uncomfortable. After careful deliberation, this board has reached a preliminary conclusion. Sergeant Holloway, your conduct, while technically within regulations, demonstrated a significant lapse in judgment regarding the appropriate treatment of enemy prisoners. Effective immediately, German prisoners are prohibited from working in the kitchen. All meal planning must be approved in advance by camp administration. You will receive a formal written reprimand to be placed in your personnel file. And, Reverend Michaels prompted. And, Morrison continued with visible reluctance, you are to submit a written apology to be read at this Sunday's interfaith service, acknowledging your error and judgment and affirming your commitment to American values. The room swayed slightly. They gripped the edge of the table, focused on keeping her breathing even. And if I refuse? Then we'll have no choice but to terminate your employment, Morrison said. I'm sorry, Sergeant, but you've put me in an impossible position. Mae stood. May I have until Sunday to prepare my statement? Of course. She left the conference room with her spine straight and her head high, but once she was alone in the kitchen, she allowed herself to slump against the prep counter, to let the exhaustion wash over her like a wave. Through the window, she could see the German women in the courtyard, taking their afternoon exercise period. Greta was teaching a younger woman some kind of stretching routine. Ilse sat on a bench with a book. Helga walked slow circles, her lips moving in silent prayer. They looked so ordinary, these women who'd fought for the wrong side of history. So frighteningly, achingly ordinary. Mae pulled out a pad of paper and a pencil. She had 3 days to write words that would either save her job or confirm her as a traitor to everything she was supposed to hold dear. She stared at the blank page for a long time before finally beginning to write. Mae didn't sleep Thursday night. She sat at her small kitchen table in her renting room above the drugstore, writing and rewriting the apology she was supposed to deliver on Sunday. Each version felt like a betrayal of herself, or of the principle she thought she believed in, or of Tommy's memory, or of the 73 women who'd wept over turkey they never expected to taste. Around midnight, she gave up on the apology and started writing something else entirely, a letter to her brother that would never be read. Dear Tommy, I don't know if you can hear me wherever you are. Mom says you're in heaven, that God takes care of soldiers who die for their country. I hope she's right. I hope you're somewhere warm and safe, somewhere the war can't reach you anymore. I've been thinking about that last letter you sent me, the one where you wrote about the French girl and the restaurant you wanted to open. You said killing people was making you feel like you were drowning from the inside out. You said every time you pulled the trigger, you felt a little less like yourself and a little more like something you didn't recognize. I fed the enemy Thanksgiving dinner, Tommy. I gave them turkey and sweet potatoes and pie, and they cried. Some of them actually cried, tears running down their faces as they ate, and I don't know what that means or what I'm supposed to do with it. The town wants me to apologize. They want me to stand up in church and say I was wrong, that I forgot about all the boys who died, that I let sympathy for the enemy cloud my judgment. And maybe I did. Maybe I should have given them thin soup and stale bread and let my anger do the cooking. But Tommy, I keep thinking about what Grandma used to say, that food is the only honest language, that you can tell more about a person from how they cook than from what they say. And I think maybe feeding people, really feeding them, is the opposite of killing them. I think maybe it's the thing we do when we remember we're all human, even the ones who fought on the wrong side. I miss you every single day. I miss your stupid jokes and the way you'd steal bites of whatever I was making before it was ready. I missed having someone who understood why cooking mattered, why it was more than just putting food on plates. I don't know what you'd want me to do, but I hope, God, I hope, that you'd understand why I did it. Love always, Mae. She folded the letter, tucked it into the Bible Tommy had carried through basic training, the one the Army had returned to their mother, along with his dog tags and pocket watch. Then she went back to writing the apology, and this time the words came easier, though not in the way the review board expected. Saturday morning, Greta appeared at the kitchen door. She wasn't supposed to be there. The prohibition on German kitchen workers had been absolute, but she came anyway, standing in the cold November rain with her arms wrapped around herself. "Please," she said when Mae opened the door, "I must speak." Mae should have sent her away, should have followed the directive, protected her own position. Instead, she stepped aside and let Greta enter, handed her a towel to dry her face and hair. They sat at the small table where Mae took her breaks, and Greta spoke in halting English, her hands moving to supplement words she didn't have. My brother, he was soldier. Not Nazi, not believing in the hate, just soldier because they make him. He die in Russia. Cold and hunger and... She couldn't find the words, but Mae understood. She'd heard enough stories by now, had pieced together enough fragments from overheard conversations and camp reports. Your dinner, the Thanksgiving. My family, we have holiday too. Erntendankfest, Harvest Festival. My mother make Kartoffelsalat, potato salad and roast meat, and we give thanks for food, for family. Her voice broke. But then war, and food is for soldiers only, and my mother is cooking with nothing, rotten vegetables, no meat for years, and I think she forget how to make something beautiful. Tears streamed down her face now, and she didn't try to wipe them away. When I taste your turkey, I remember. I remember before the war, before hate, before everything broken. I remember my mother cooking, my brother laughing, my father telling stories. I remember when food was love, not just surviving. Mae reached across the table, took Greta's hand. The gesture was dangerous, flagrantly violated about 6 different regulations, but she didn't care. I understand, she said quietly. They say you must apologize. I hear God's talking. They say you give us too much kindness, and now you are punished. Fresh tears. This is my fault. No, Mae said firmly. This is not your fault. This is about people being scared and angry and not knowing what to do with it. In Germany, we have word Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It means coming to terms with past, understanding what we do wrong, what we let happen. It is very hard word, very hard work. She looked at Mae directly. The confession hung between them, heavy as stone. I am guilty, Greta said. Not for fighting. I never hold weapon, but for saying nothing, for being, how you say, complicit. And I do not ask forgiveness because I do not deserve, but your dinner, your kindness, it give me something. It give me memory of being human, not just being shame. Mae felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked tight since the day Tommy's telegram arrived. My brother died in the Ardennes, she said. He was 22 years old. He wanted to open a restaurant after the war, wanted to cook food that made people happy instead of killing people that made him feel dead inside. Greta nodded slowly. My brother was 19. He write me letters from Russia. He say he is so cold, so hungry, so tired. He say he want to come home, sleep in his own bed, eat my mother's Kartoffelsalat. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He do not come home. They sat together in silence, 2 women who'd lost brothers to the same war from different sides, and Mae understood that grief didn't respect borders or politics or which flag you'd fought under. Grief was just grief, vast and awful and utterly human. I don't know how to apologize, Mae admitted. They want me to say I was wrong to feed you well, wrong to treat you like people, but I can't say that and mean it. Then do not say, Greta said simply. My father, he'd teach me, truth is truth, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear. Mae dressed in her best civilian clothes, a navy blue dress with pearl buttons, stockings without runs, shoes she'd polished until they gleamed. She walked to the First Methodist Church with her written statement folded in her coat pocket, and she felt Tommy walking beside her like a ghost, like permission. The church was packed, every pew full, people standing along the walls, craning their necks to see. Mae recognized faces from town, the grocer who'd sold her the cranberries, the librarian who helped her find cookbooks, the mailman who delivered letters from her mother. They watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Reverend Michaels welcomed the congregation with his booming voice, led them through hymns and prayers, and finally introduced Mae with the words, "We have with us this morning Sergeant Mae Holloway, who will address recent events at Camp Meridian." Mae walked to the front of the church, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She stood behind the lectern, looked out at the sea of faces, and pulled the paper from her pocket. Then she tore it in half. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. "I was told to apologize," Mae said, her voice steady and clear. "I was told to stand before you and say I was wrong to feed German prisoners a Thanksgiving meal, wrong to treat enemy personnel with kindness, wrong to forget that these women fought for a regime that killed our sons and brothers and husbands." She paused. Let the words settle. "I won't apologize for feeding people. I won't apologize for remembering that every person, even our enemies, deserves basic human dignity. I won't apologize for choosing to see women who cry over turkey because it reminds them of mothers and brothers they've lost, because it reminds them they're still human underneath everything the war tried to turn them into." Angry murmurs now, people shifting in their seats. "My brother Tommy died in the Ardennes. He was killed by German soldiers, maybe by someone who knew one of the women in that camp, maybe by someone they called a friend. I think about that every single day. I think about how he'll never open his restaurant, never tease me about overcooking the roast, never sit at Grandma's table again." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "And I think about what he wrote in his last letter to me. He said killing people was making him feel like he was drowning from the inside out. He said he didn't want to be the kind of person who could pull the trigger without it costing him something essential." She looked directly at Mrs. Brickman, at Reverend Michaels, at all the faces full of righteous anger. "I believe we honor our dead by refusing to become the kind of people they died fighting against. I believe we honor them by remembering that mercy is stronger than vengeance, that feeding people is the opposite of killing them, that choosing to see someone's humanity, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult, is what separates us from the evil we claim to oppose." Over the following years, Mae's work expanded to 15 facilities nationwide. The women she'd served returned to Germany, carrying memories of unexpected kindness. Annalise became a translator, building bridges between nations. Ilse opened a bakery called The Bridge in Munich. Greta became a nurse, serving refugees, determined to honor the mercy she'd received by showing mercy to others. 10 years after that first Thanksgiving, Mae opened her own restaurant, also called The Bridge, where American veterans and German immigrants worked side by side, where the menu itself was an act of reconciliation. The annual reunion dinners brought together everyone touched by that original meal, now with children who grew up knowing that hatred wasn't inevitable, that people could choose differently. Mae Holloway proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't violence, it's choosing to see humanity in your enemy. One meal, served with dignity and love, became the foundation for healing that rippled across generations.
If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of courage, compassion, and the quiet heroes who changed the world one choice at a time. Hit that subscribe button because these stories deserve